What if miracles don't come wrapped in light, but hidden inside the noise before the storm? What if faith is not proven in a church queue, but in a wooden house with peeling paint, standing alone before a sea that remembers every name it has ever taken? On the forgotten coast of Louisiana, Grace and David Miller waited for the hurricane that had not yet earned a name, a storm that would test not only their home, but the meaning of what they believed. Before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary have reached. Their house stood at the lip of St. Helena Bay, where the marsh met the Gulf, and every evening turned the water copper. It was humble, stubborn, a structure built by David's father 40 years ago, patched a dozen times but never rebuilt. To outsiders, it looked tired. To Grace, it breathed. The porch faced east, towards sunrise. On its corner stood a small statue of the Virgin Mary, her hands open, her robe pale from years of salt and sun. It wasn't elegant, a cheap resin figure bought from a roadside shop outside Lafayette, but Grace treated it like relic and mother all at once. It had belonged to her mother before her. "Keep her where you can see the dawn," her mother had said. "Where she stands, peace will stand too." Grace never moved the statue, not once. Hurricanes had come and gone, Camille, Betsy, Katrina, and still, Mary stood. When David hammered boards across the windows, she only wiped the rain from the Virgin's face and whispered, "Stay with us." That summer had been long and golden, the air thick with the scent of magnolia and gasoline, the hum of cicadas heavy as heat itself. Then one Friday morning, the radio's tone changed. The announcer's voice trembled as he read the update. "Tropical storm Helena, strengthening rapidly. Category 4 potential. Evacuation recommended for all coastal residents." David shut the radio off before the last word. He stared at the horizon, where a bruise-colored cloud had begun to gather. "Grace, we're leaving. Tonight." Grace shook her head. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "This house has stood through worse. It's part of the land. So are we." David exhaled sharply. "You sound like your mother." Grace smiled faintly. She wasn't wrong. By dusk, the wind had begun to change its song. It no longer whispered through the reeds. It hummed, low, deep, as if the Gulf itself was breathing heavier. David nailed the boards, cursing the wind, but his eyes kept drifting to the statue, as if daring it to prove him wrong. The chimes outside clanged like broken bells from a drowned church. Grace packed candles, water, the radio, and a rosary. She moved slower than fear would allow, as though each gesture was a form of faith. The generator coughed to life. Somewhere beyond the marsh, a heron took flight, too early for its nightly pattern. At twilight, Grace stepped out to the porch one last time. The air felt strange, too still, as though the world had forgotten how to breathe. She brushed her fingers across the Virgin's cold hands. "Keep watch," she whispered. And then it happened. Small, almost nothing. A single magnolia petal, out of season, drifted down from nowhere and stuck to Mary's palm. Grace frowned, blinking against the wind. "That's impossible," she murmured, but she didn't move it. Inside, David was pacing. The storm's track had shifted east, directly toward them. "It's not stopping," he said. His hands trembled slightly as he checked the locks, the boards, the flashlight batteries again. Grace turned to him. "Then neither will we." By nightfall, the first fingers of rain began to tap the windows. Gentle, deceitful. David stood at the doorway, watching the bay he'd fished since he was 10 disappear into gray. "This isn't faith," he muttered. "It's madness." Grace, kneeling by the statue, didn't answer. Her rosary clicked softly in the dark. Then the rain became teeth. Wind slammed the house, not knocking, but trying to tear its way in. The floorboards vibrated, shutters screamed. Water licked the threshold, tasting the wood before devouring. David shouted over the roar, "We have to go upstairs!" Grace clutched the statue with both hands, the rosary tangling around her wrists. "She's here! She won't let go!" The lights flickered. Once, twice, then vanished. Only the flash of lightning gave shape to the room, each burst like a photograph of chaos. A chair overturned, a window cracking, David's silhouette framed in white, and the statue, small, unyielding, gleaming faintly in the dark. Thunder tore through the house. Grace's prayer rose like a gasp. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us now and at the hour of our—" The rest was ripped from her lips as the roof tore away, swallowing the word death into the storm's mouth. For a moment, there was only light. Not the sterile flash of lightning, but something softer, older, like radiance bending through water. Grace's eyes met David's across the chaos. He reached for her. The world bent sideways. And then, silence. When the morning came, neighbors would say they heard nothing after midnight, that the storm had screamed itself out over St. Helena Bay and vanished toward the Gulf. But those who lived closest to the Millers swore they saw one strange thing in the hours before dawn. A faint glow, hovering where the porch used to be. And the statue, the Virgin Mary, streaked with mud and salt, still standing, untouched, a magnolia petal pressed against her open hand.
The morning after, silence felt heavier than the storm. Ash-gray clouds dragged across a wounded sky. The bay had swallowed fences, porches, entire streets. 20 houses, gone, flattened into splinters. Only one shape still stood in defiance, the Miller's home, bent but breathing. And in front of it, untouched, upright, calm, the Virgin Mary, her white robe washed clean by salt water, her face turned toward the ruins, as if keeping vigil over what was left. When the rescuers came, their boots sank into the soaked ground. Radios cracked. Names were shouted. "Grace Miller? David Miller?" No one answered. Then a medic called out softly. They found Grace clutching David's hand, his wedding ring cutting into her palm, the only wound the storm couldn't claim. Both were alive, barely, bruised, trembling, their skins streaked with mud and rain, but alive. When Grace opened her eyes, she looked past the rescuers, straight toward the statue. "She held us," she whispered. "She held the house." David turned his head weakly. The Virgin's silhouette stood against the wreckage, unbroken. His eyes glistened. A single tear rolled through the mud on his cheek. No one heard what he murmured, but his lips formed two words: "Thank you." By noon, the news vans had arrived. Drones hovered. Headlines wrote themselves. "Hurricane destroys 20 homes. Virgin statue left standing." But cameras couldn't capture what hung in the air. The scent, faint, impossible, of magnolia. Out of season, out of place, as if the wind itself remembered prayer. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the ruin. An old Cajun fisherman removed his cap, crossing himself. "There ain't no storm leaves mercy like that," he said. A child tried to touch Mary's hand. Her mother pulled her back gently. "Let her rest, Chair," she whispered. Grace refused to leave. When the Red Cross offered shelter, she shook her head. "If she's staying, I'm staying." That night, she sat beside the statue, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. a candle flickering in the damp air. David watched from what was left of the doorway. He had cursed the wind, doubted every prayer, but now as he saw his wife lit by the candle's trembling glow, his voice softened. "I don't understand why we're alive, but thank you." For the first time, he didn't sound angry. 3 days later, when volunteers came to clear the debris, one of them dropped his hammer near the statue and froze. "Ma'am," he called out, voice shaking, "there's oil coming from her feet." Grace knelt down. The Virgin's marble toes shimmered with a thin sheen of clear oil, glistening as it gathered, slow and deliberate, like tears. And again, that fragrance, magnolia. The workers stepped back, whispering, "It ain't from us. We ain't using oil." Grace just stared. "Then it's from heaven." That night, Father Raymond arrived, a man known more for reason than for faith's trembling edge. He ran a cloth under the Virgin's feet, examined it under lamplight. No residue, no candle soot, no perfume. Then he exhaled deeply. "She weeps," he said quietly, "for what was lost and for what was spared." Word spread faster than any storm. Pilgrims began to appear, not from across oceans this time, but from the next parish over, from towns the flood had swallowed. A fisherman left his shrimp net at the base. "She netted Grace where I only caught shrimp," he said. A teenage girl from Baton Rouge tied a faded purple ribbon around the railing. "For Mama, lost in Katrina's water." People came not to see a miracle, but to stand near one, even for a moment. The diocese soon intervened. Investigators took samples of the oil, photographs, measurements. Weeks later, the bishop's note arrived, handwritten and brief. "Non explicable naturale via," not explainable by natural means. Let the people judge with their hearts. The parish framed that note beside the statue. It didn't prove anything. It didn't need to. David rebuilt the porch himself. Each hammer strike sounded like penance, like prayer. Grace tended the small garden that grew again from the mud. Sometimes she'd find magnolia petals scattered by the wind, even when the tree out back was bare. Reporters came, then left. The world moved on. But the house remained. The statue still stood, her gaze fixed toward the sea, unflinching. On the anniversary of the storm, Grace lit one candle. Its flame trembled in the soft Gulf wind. She looked up at the Virgin's face, streaked faintly where the oil had once flowed. She whispered, "Thank you for staying." And in the hush, or perhaps in the wind's new gentleness, something brushed against her heart. Not sound, not voice, just a presence that felt like breath on her soul. She thought it heard it say, "I always do." Or maybe it was only the wind, softer now, carrying the scent home. The months that followed blurred into a strange rhythm of silence and prayer. What had once been the miller's front yard, a patch of wreckage and wild grass, became something else entirely. A circle of footprints marked where people knelt. A trail of melted candles scarred the ground like wax-made halos. Every dawn, Grace would find small offerings left by strangers. A sailor's medal, a child's drawing of the Virgin cradling a house, a half-burned rosary, its beads fused by heat. She never moved them. They belonged to her, she'd say softly. David, meanwhile, lived between awe and unease. He'd once sworn off miracles, a man of lumber and bolts, not incense and mysteries. But every time he swept the porch, that faint magnolia scent lingered, clinging to the wood as if carried by memory. He told himself it was impossible. Then he'd pause, look at the statue, and his jaw would tighten. "She's proving me wrong, isn't she?" he murmured once, half a smile breaking through the disbelief. By midsummer, the church sent word from Mobile. The diocese would open an official inquiry. A team of priests, scientists, and a Vatican-appointed exorcist would come. They arrived quietly, 3 men in dark coats, 1 woman with a folder marked De Miraculous, case no 45-B. They didn't bless the house, they measured it. They scraped the base of the statue for samples, took photos under ultraviolet light, collected fragments of dried oil in glass vials. One of them, Father De Luca, spoke with a voice that carried both reverence and suspicion. "Grace Miller," he began, "you claim the oil appeared without human interference?" Grace clasped her hands. "I don't claim anything, Father. I only saw what I saw." He studied her face for a long moment and then nodded. That's often how miracles begin. The exorcist, Father Iannuzzi, tested the oil himself under lamplight. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "It's pure," he said, his Italian accent rounding the word like prayer. "No scent of chemicals, no origin we can name. Not demonic, but not ordinary." He crossed himself. "Heaven doesn't knock, it seeps in." That line stayed with David for weeks. He started keeping a journal, though he'd never written one before. Not of theology or confession, just fragments. The oil never dried, the flowers still bloom. Grace hums Ave Maria when she thinks I'm asleep. Each word a quiet surrender. By midsummer, the story reached beyond Alabama. Pilgrims arrived by busloads now, though no one called them that out loud. They came in jeans and work shirts, carrying what was left of their lives. A man from Biloxi stood in the yard, tears cutting paths through the salt on his face. "My house was 3 blocks down," he said to Grace. "We found nothing but the crossbeam. And then this." He touched the statue's base, his hand trembling. "It's like she moved here for a reason." Another visitor, a nurse from Shreveport, came limping, a brace on her knee. She left behind a stethoscope wrapped in a blue ribbon. "She saved my patient during Ida. He woke up saying he saw a lady in white standing by his bed, said her eyes looked like peace." Grace would listen, sometimes smile, sometimes cry. "Every story feels like a piece of the same prayer," she told Father Raymond. "Different voices, one mother." But not everyone believed. A local journalist, known for debunking miracle myths, arrived one morning with a camera crew. He called the statue an emotional anchor in a traumatized town. David confronted him. "You think oil leaks from marble because people want it to?" The man shrugged. "Hope leaks easier than oil." David stared him down. "Then maybe you've never seen real hope." That afternoon, a storm broke again. Small, sudden, nothing like the hurricane, but when lightning struck nearby, the journalist's equipment short-circuited. His camera froze on one frame, a blur of light where the Virgin's eyes should have been. He deleted the footage that night, saying nothing, but weeks later his name appeared in a donation log for the local parish, underlined simply, "For Our Lady's House." The diocese completed their investigation before Advent. They found no fraud, no trickery, no natural explanation. The final report came sealed in cream-colored parchment, stamped with the bishop's red wax crest. It read, "Non explicabile naturale via," not explainable by natural means. Let the people judge with their hearts. Father Raymond read it out loud during Mass. No applause followed, only silence, thick as incense. And then, almost timidly, someone began the Hail Mary. The rest joined in. It wasn't ceremony. It was gratitude given a voice. The statue remained untouched, but something in its eyes seemed to shift, a softness deeper than stone. When sunlight passed through the window at dusk, her face gleamed faintly, as if alive in prayer. Grace often sat there in the evenings, her rosary beads moving like slow rain through her fingers. Sometimes she'd look up and think she saw the faint outline of a magnolia petal pressed against Mary's hand, the same one that had drifted from nowhere that night. She never told David,
But he noticed her smiling more, even when the scars still ached. One night, after closing the blinds, he whispered, "I still don't understand all this." Grace looked at him. "Maybe we're not meant to. Maybe miracles don't explain, they remind." He nodded. "Remind us of what?" She touched the statue's base gently. "That love doesn't drown." Outside, the wind moved through the broken trees, carrying a whisper of magnolia and salt. And far beyond the bay, where the hurricane had once roared, the sea shimmered calm, as if heaven itself had remembered mercy.
Winter draped bay shore in quiet gray. The sea no longer raged, it breathed, slow and spent, as if remembering what it had destroyed. Salt still glittered on the window frames of the miller's rebuilt home, and the air carried the faint scent of brine and soot, reminders of the night the world came undone. Grace began keeping a notebook beside the statue. Not for herself, she said, but for others. Visitors would arrive, whisper their thanks or grief, and leave a note pressed between the pages. "Thank you for saving my daughter. Forgive me for doubting. I'm still alive somehow." Each entry read like a heartbeat, and though she never said it, Grace felt the statue seemed to listen. David would linger nearby, pretending to check repairs or sweep dust from the sill. But his eyes kept drifting toward the figure, the one he'd once mocked as superstition. He remembered the night the storm screamed, how Grace's voice had been swallowed mid-prayer. He remembered the silence that followed. He had survived the hurricane, but it was she who had weathered the fear. Sometimes when he looked at the statue, he felt a tug of something that wasn't quite belief, but wasn't doubt either. He said nothing of it, only stood longer than before. One evening, Grace invited Father Raymond to bless the house again. The priest came with a handful of parishioners, widows, fishermen, a nurse who had lost her brother to the flood. They gathered around the statue, their faces lit by candlelight trembling in the wind. As Father prayed, a single camellia bud, winter white, cracked open at Mary's feet, though the bush that bore it had long since died in the flood. The room fell still. Grace's lips trembled. "She's still here," she whispered. The story spread once more, not by broadcast or rumor, but through voices passing quietly over kitchen tables, through rosaries held tighter at night. A Cajun fisherman came first. His weathered hands carried an old shrimping net, still damp with salt. "He caught more than fish," he said, leaving it by the statue. "He caught me." A teenage girl from Baton Rouge followed days later. She tied a faded purple ribbon at Mary's feet. "For Mama," she whispered. "Katrina took her. Maybe now she's home." Each visitor brought something broken and left lighter. The statue's marble glimmered faintly in every light, not wet, not polished, but alive, like breath on stone. Even those who had once doubted began to return. The journalist who'd called it mass hysteria came back alone, without his camera crew. He stood silently, slipped a silver pen, the same he'd used to write the article, into the soil. "I was wrong," he said to no one in particular. The wind answered for him, brushing the air with something between salt and incense. Soon after, a package arrived from the diocese. Inside, Grace found a handwritten note from Bishop Alvarez, the same man who had quietly visited Bay Shore months before. He had lost his own rectory to Katrina, yet refused to leave his parishioners. In uneven Latin, he had written, "Ex mea experientia non naturale." For my experience, not natural. Below it, a single line. Sometimes, heaven leaves no signature, only the silence that follows mercy. Grace framed the letter beside the statue. Weeks passed. The visitors slowed, but the notebook kept filling. One day, David found a new entry that read, "From Florida, our statue stood in the fire. Is it the same lady?" Grace read it 3 times, tracing the handwriting with her fingers. "Maybe," she whispered, "maybe she's walking the coast again." Months later, another envelope arrived. Inside was a photograph, a blackened neighborhood, a single white house, untouched, and in front of it, the same virgin statue, gleaming as if washed by light itself. On the back of the photo, only 3 words were written: "She stayed again." Grace pressed the photo to her chest. She didn't cry. She only closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." That night, thunder murmured far out at sea. David awoke to find Grace sitting by the window, rosary in hand, candle flickering beside her. "You're praying again?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly. "No, listening." He hesitated, then sat beside her, the candlelight catching the silver in his hair. Outside, the wind rattled the trees but did not enter. For a long while they said nothing. Then David looked toward the statue and asked, almost shyly, "Can you teach me the Hail Mary?" Grace nodded, her voice low but steady. "Hail Mary, full of grace." He followed clumsily, the words unfamiliar but sincere. And as he spoke, the storm beyond the bay began to fade, not vanish, but soften, as if heaven had leaned closer to listen. By morning, sunlight streamed through the repaired windows. The light caught the statue's face, making it glow pale gold. The camellia at its feet had dried overnight, perfectly preserved. Grace reached out, her hand trembling just enough to make the candle's shadow dance. "Thank you for staying," she said. A breeze slipped through the crack beneath the door, gentle, almost warm, and in it, carried faintly, like a whisper passing from sea to soul, came a voice. Or perhaps it was only the wind, but Grace thought she heard, "I always do."
The months after the storm felt different, not just for the Millers, but for Bayshore itself. The air seemed to carry an awareness, a quiet attentiveness, as if the sea and sky remembered what they had once destroyed and what they had failed to take. Word of the miracle spread in ripples rather than waves. There were no headlines this time, no reporters crowding the front yard. Instead, stories traveled by phone calls, by murmurs exchanged in grocery store aisles, by the way someone would pause, point at the church bulletin board, and whisper, "It's them, the Millers." Grace didn't seek attention. She still gardened barefoot, still lined up soup cans by expiration date, still checked the mailbox twice a day as if expecting something holy to arrive by ordinary post. But her house became something more than a home. People came not to stare, but to breathe, as if the air there held a kind of peace you could borrow, even if only for a moment. Among the visitors was a young widow from Alabama. She came with her baby swaddled in a faded hospital blanket. When she stepped into the living room, the child stopped crying for the first time in days. She didn't speak. She only nodded once, then placed a single white feather on the windowsill beneath the statue. Another visitor was a weathered old man who had once worked for FEMA. He left a rusted name badge by the base of the Virgin's feet and whispered, "I spent my life measuring what was lost. This is the first time I've seen what survived." Grace never asked their names. She only smiled, offered them tea, and said, "You can leave your burdens here if you like. She doesn't mind the wait." The bishop returned once more, this time without his clerical entourage. He wore plain clothes, his collar tucked into his pocket. The storm had taken his home years ago, and his heart still bore the shape of its absence. He sat with Grace at the kitchen table. The sunlight, dappled through lace curtains, painted them both in soft gold. He finally spoke. "Grace," he said quietly,
We have reviewed everything: witness statements, photographs, the damage reports. Some claim it's a coincidence. Others, he hesitated. Others call it divine. Grace's eyes met his. And you? The bishop exhaled, fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. He said slowly, "In Rome, we have a phrase, ex mea experienza non naturale. From my own experience, not natural. That's as far as the church will go, at least for now." Grace smiled faintly. Sometimes that's enough. He nodded, his gaze wandering toward the statue. Sometimes silence is the loudest approval heaven gives. That night, after the bishop had left, Grace found another letter slipped under the front door. No return address. Inside was a photograph, this time not from Florida, but from another coast. The image was blurry, taken at dawn. A house standing untouched amid blackened debris, a virgin statue in front, hallowed by smoke. On the back, only one sentence: "She stayed again." Grace placed it in the notebook, beside the entry from Florida, and whispered, "Then she's still walking." The following Sunday, the Millers returned to Mass together for the first time since the storm. The church was smaller than before, its roof patched, its pews mismatched, but every seat was filled. Father Raymond spoke of Job and of storms that test faith, but his words soon gave way to silence. From the back of the church, Grace rose. She didn't plan to speak, but the quiet pulled her forward. "When the hurricane came," she said, her voice trembling yet clear, "I thought God had forgotten us. But maybe he was just waiting for us to remember him first." No applause followed, only tears, the quiet kind, the kind that cleanse. After the service, children ran through the courtyard, chasing each other between puddles left by an early rain. One boy stopped by the statue in front of the church, a small replica of the Miller's own. He touched its foot and whispered, "Please stay with us too." Then he ran off, laughter echoing down the stone path. David watched from the doorway, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't a man of many words, but that morning he asked Grace something that startled her. "Will you teach me the rosary again?" Her smile was gentle, proud. "Yes, but this time you start it." And he did, slowly, haltingly, but with sincerity. The beads clicked between his fingers like raindrops returning to the sea. In the weeks that followed, Grace's garden bloomed out of season. Lilies rose where none had been planted, and along the fence line, the camellia bush, long declared dead, began to bear buds again. One morning, a winter white bloom cracked open at the statue's feet. Grace touched it, eyes closed, whispering, "You kept your promise." That evening, as dusk fell, the wind picked up again, not fierce this time, gentle like a mother smoothing the hair of a restless child. Grace lit a candle, and David joined her by the window. They prayed together, not for safety this time, but for gratitude. And in that stillness, Grace thought she heard something, not a voice, not even a whisper, but a breath passing through her soul. She turned to David. "Do you hear it?" He listened. The air was warm, tinged with salt and sweetness, jasmine maybe, or something older. He said, "I think it's the sea, remembering." But Grace knew better. It wasn't the sea. It was a presence, familiar, quiet, constant. The same that had stood with them when the roof tore open and the wind swallowed the word death. She smiled, pressing her hands together. "Welcome back," she whispered. And in that moment, the house exhaled, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for months. The statue remained where it had always been, untouched by salt, unweathered by time. Around it, the air shimmered faintly, as though warmed from within. Grace would never claim a miracle. She didn't need to. She had lived one. And when visitors asked if the story was true, she would simply point to the garden, where the camellias bloomed winter after winter, and say, "Faith doesn't need proof. It just needs to stay."